Well, let's go back to that time. It was 50 years ago that Canada played Russia, or the Soviet Union, I guess, more accurately, in what was called the Summit Series. And it was essentially a series that was created sort of out of nothing, but as a result of the fact that Canada's best had not played Russia's best for some period of time. The Canadians were not participating in world championships. The Russians were uber dominant. And there was this sense that, well, our best should play their best. And so they arranged this 8-game series, 4 games in Canada, 4 games in Russia. And I'm trying to go back in my mind, 50 years, a long time, to what the sense was as we got this thing started. And the sense really was that Canada was going to wipe the floor with these Russian players. Even though the Canadian players weren't in very good shape, they weren't really probably taking it all that seriously. Nonetheless, how could whoever these Russians were, and we knew none of them really, how could they even be close to the level of competition that the National Hockey League could present? Scotty, did you feel that way? Were you among those who thought this was going to be a wipeout?
I did, because that's what we were being told. I mean, it was in the media, it was surrounded the team. I mean, the world was such a different place back then, and it is a long time ago, but you didn't have the World Wide Web yet, and you didn't have any form of social media, and we didn't know much about the Soviets other than they were this black and white image that we saw on the nightly news, and they scared us because they were communists and they were taking over countries, and the Cold War was in effect at the time, but you didn't see world championships on TV the way we do now. You might see them occasionally, a game here, a game there, perhaps in an Olympics, but we didn't know much about them. But what we did know is that the NHL was the best league in the world. The Canadian game was the best game in the world. And how could anybody possibly come close to playing at our level? Because even our best amateurs, although they weren't winning, and that was a great source of frustration and impetus to have this series, but they were still close. So if they could be close, then how could anybody be close to playing the best NHL talent? And that was the mindset going in. The players were fed that storyline too. There were some people, some players like a Brian Conacher and the late Billy Harris, who had played internationally, coached internationally, who cautioned against having that attitude. But by and large, virtually everybody thought that it was going to be a lark, a cakewalk. And that's why the players, even though, they didn't train in the summer back then, that's what training camp was for. They all had jobs in the summer, whether it was hockey schools or, being the pitchmen for the breweries and things like that. They went into it thinking this was going to be a little vacation. And, well, they were surprised.
There were no Russians in the National Hockey League back then. Were there any Europeans? I can't remember.
There had been one, and they actually had a confrontation with him in the middle of the series when they had the break after the 4 games in Canada, and they went to Sweden for 8 days. And it was Ulf Sterner, who had played briefly for the New York Rangers, and wasn't welcome, didn't feel welcome at any point during his brief NHL tenure. But there were no Soviets at that point. We started to see some defections later in the 80s, and was it Pryakin, I think, was the first player, the first Soviet came over with Cliff Fletcher in Calgary. John, you might recall that.
Yeah. The before we actually talk about the 8 games, Alan Eagleson gets credit for being the driving force, but was he really the driving force? And were there other Canadians that were trying to push this thing down the road?
Well, he was certainly a big factor in that series coming together. It's interesting because the Soviets, I use the word bored, but they were getting bored with dominating international hockey at the time. And it was actually one of the columnists in one of the Moscow papers that floated the concept. So, at that time, if somebody in the media in Moscow is floating an idea, it's coming from the Kremlin, but floated this idea of having a best on best series because they wanted to see just how good they could be. And again, back in those days, and maybe that mindset still exists today, but it was, the Cold War was on. It was democracy versus communism, us versus them. And a lot of times, if you could put an athlete on a podium and put a gold medal on around their neck, that was promoting your way of life, your system, your politics, everything was better. And so I think there was a feeling that if they could get on the big stage and show just how good they were as a hockey nation, that it was another chance to kind of boast about themselves. So they floated the idea, and there was somebody in the, a fellow by the name actually of Gary Smith, who's got a good book out, Ice Diplomat, about the series, about how he was involved in it. He was in the embassy and his job was to read the papers every day. And he saw this and he immediately sent a note to Ottawa saying, the Soviets are floating this idea. What do you guys think? And then, so that was one angle where it came from. Pierre Trudeau was the prime minister at the time, and Canada was in a tough way from the standpoint that we had the FLQ crisis in 1970. There was a bit of a division, and so there's problems in Quebec. The West felt kind of distant. The country was in a rough form after going through a really good time in 60, 67 with the Expo and the Centennial. And he thought that maybe something like a hockey series, us going on and flexing our muscles and showing how good we were, would be something that could help bring the country together and turn the attention onto something positive for a change. And, there was an election looming at the same time. And then, of course, Eagleson had for several years thought about the idea of trying to create a World Cup of hockey, because the story was he was sitting at his cottage with Bobby Orr and Carl Brewer, and they were listening to the World Cup of Soccer in 1966 on the radio. And he said, we got to have one of these days. So they all kind of came together independently, but together at the same time, if that makes sense. So there were several driving forces behind this. And, Hockey Canada was just launched because we were so concerned about how poorly we were faring on the international stage. So you had Hockey Canada, CAHA. So there were a lot of groups that came together to push this through. But Eagleson ultimately became, the driving force and the quasi general manager of the team, if you will.